Hi there, I've just been watching a video called A World Without a Worldview, which is a presentation made by Alan McFarlane, who I'd never come across before, but it's very interesting. He's talking about postmodernism, and it's about a half-an-hour video. I'd really recommend people have a look at it. I'll put the link in the description below. And he's talking about various changes that take place under postmodernism. It's a good description of what he thinks postmodernism is. Some good criticisms of the concept, but also I think some provocations, what I'm thinking of provocations. I'll just say before I start that personally I think that the idea of the postmodern has some value in some areas of thought and practice, and less value in others. It certainly is an overused concept, and some of the critiques that Alan McFarlane makes of it I would completely support. However, some of the things that he talks about, or that he introduces but doesn't perhaps develop, are some things I want to pick up on. So I'll just give some of the things he mentions here, just to give a bit of a background to the aspects of postmodernism that I'm kind of interested in here. He's talking a bit about authority, and that's one of the things that the ideas that comes through in various different forms throughout his presentation, and how postmodernism represents a crisis of authority or a critique of authority, and he seems to be locating it in contrast to obviously modernity, modernism, and the Enlightenment tradition, and the kinds of authorities which are in place during those times, and perhaps prior to that, which postmodernism calls into question. And he makes some interesting analogies actually, because he compares. By authority, what he means is, where do you look for truth? Where do you look for knowledge? And what he's going to go on to argue is to say that these things are a bit of a pick and mix these days, and there is no source of authority under postmodernism. I wouldn't say that personally, but that's where he's heading for this discussion. Whereas he's kind of saying in the good old days of modernism and pre-modernism, there were sources of authority, and he compares the authority. As examples of authority, he cites parental authority, the authority of parents, the authority of teachers, and the authority of politicians. And I think it's really good that he does that, because I think for me that what that does is just demonstrate the confusions that people have about authority, and how the notion of authority has changed over time, and how it's a much more complex idea than it used to be. Because I think there must have been a time, and there still is, in our kind of vernacular use of the word authority, when it meant not only access to knowledge, a kind of means of validating what you know is to be true, but it also meant something to do with control and power. And the fact that he's citing politicians and parents alongside teachers is part of that, because certainly parents, teachers and politicians all have power over us, as well as have perhaps access to knowledge resources that we would want to gain from. And particularly, of course, politicians and parents. Parental authority, being told what to do as well as being told what is true, is really significant in that, I think, isn't it? And that certainly is a set of questions, a set of ideas that have been brought into question, not just because of the advent of postmodernism, but because of other kinds of more democratic ways of working in the world, the increase in social democracy movements, those kinds of things. So I think that idea that authority, and what he calls reverence for authority, which is a really significant and lauded term, isn't it? The idea that authority is something to be revered, as opposed to critiqued, or just simply approached as a resource, is kind of interesting. And to the extent that postmodernism, in the way that Alan McFarlane talks about it, but more, contemporary ways of approaching authority, to the extent that reverence is decoupled from authority, I think that's a good thing. At least because reverence carries so much baggage, doesn't it? Anyway, some things about the condition that we are in now, which he kind of claims as being the sources of postmodern thinking, the postmodern lack of worldview, he gives some examples. He talks about, for example, speed and density of telecommunications, and how there is so much of information available, so much stuff around, that it's a constant source of distraction, he says. And I think that's certainly true. I personally don't hear in that any sense or any guarantee that limiting access to information will necessarily make it more valid. It might make it feel more valid. If you've only got one book in your life, I imagine that probably feels a lot more authorial than if you have a library of 10,000 books that you know you'll never read. So yes, speed and density of telecommunication, and the fact that there is so many opportunities for distraction might create psychological problems, which is one of the things he alludes to, but certainly doesn't guarantee, to my mind, the better quality of smaller amounts of information. Another one of the symptoms he gives of postmodernity is the democratization of knowledge through availability of authorship. It's much easier to become a publisher these days, right? And many of you will have blogs, or will have YouTube channels, will have self-published books in the past. It's the gatekeepers for culture are absent now. The threshold for being able to have one's voice heard has disappeared. So access to the means by which what one thinks might be circulated is certainly easier than it was. So to that extent, the democratization of knowledge through access to one's own capacity as an author is certainly available. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's diluted the amount of good knowledge in the world. It's likely that it has. If there are millions and millions of books being made available these days, then it's quite likely that most of them will be rubbish. Therefore, you have to wade through a lot more rubbish to get to the good stuff. But there's no guarantee by that means that the stuff, that when there was only 10 books being handwritten per year, that those 10 books were the right ones. Yep. So again, there's no guarantee, because that the systems by which authorship is limited to the few essentially rest on there being gatekeepers of culture, doesn't it? It rests on there being publishers which scrutinise manuscripts and can only allow certain ones to go through, and that may be fine, but the validity of that system depends on how much the system can guarantee the authority by which it acts. Yes, and I'm not sure that is necessarily the case. It might be, but it might not. So the democratization of knowledge through availability to one's own authorship, I would agree with McFarlane that does create potential vertigos, a potential feeling that one might be drowning in a sea of potential knowledge, and knowing full well that most of it is probably rubbish, but perhaps not having the tools to filter properly. It may be a problem, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what came before was any better. He also talks about, I thought this was quite a curious one, a subversion of authority is what he refers to. Subversion of authority, kind of by allowing direct access to knowledge. The fact that we, all of us now, have direct access to a lot of the world's knowledge very easily, and good knowledge, contemporary knowledge. A lot of the best journals are available open access, for example. That kind of thing. And McFarlane seems to be suggesting that that's potentially a subversion of authority, which I thought was kind of interesting. Because as he seems to be suggesting, the only way you would get access to that knowledge, because it only exists in print form in certain university libraries, for example, and you would have to be equipped with certain tools even then to be able to find it and use it. Because that had highly restricted access, he seems to be saying that the knowledge is therefore more authoritative than knowledge which is more easily available. I mean, certainly there are more opportunities now for it to be misused, for it to be misunderstood, for badly quoted, badly referenced versions of works to gain circulation that they couldn't before, when people didn't have access to that knowledge, couldn't access that scientific journal which was only held in this library, which you had to be university student to access, or something like that. Certainly there's more opportunities for misuse of the knowledge, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the knowledge itself is being subverted, I don't think. Direct access to knowledge, I can't see how that can ever be a bad thing, providing that we, the readership, are given some kind of tools to understand what we're reading, or to be able to sort the wheat from the chaff in terms of subsequent works which draw on that. We need to know how that knowledge is being used effectively. He then goes on to talk about, he cites a few metaphors about halfway through, and for the latter third it's largely a recycling of different metaphors, powerful and interesting ones, but I think they're quite telling in many ways. Because one of the metaphors he says is that, in the past, and he's talking about the proliferation of media specifically here. He says, in the past we looked at the world through just one or two windows, and they're great big picture windows, and we can see the world. I think he cites television, conversation with friends, and books. And by books he means books that have gone through, not self-publishing processes, but books that have gone through that kind of authority-generating process of gatekeepers being, publishers being gatekeepers and only allowing through the good stuff. So you look at the world, he says, we used to look at the world through these couple of windows, maybe books and television, possibly a third window which is conversation with friends. And these are big picture windows and we get a good view of the world. But now he says that's been taken over by access to lots of different media because of the things I've spoken about before, the proliferation of media, easier access to one's own being an author and so on. So now we look at the world through thousands potentially of different windows, all of which give us a different fragmented view on a world that's much more complicated. Which may be true, that may be the case, but there seems to be in there a sense that in the good old days when we could just look through the big picture windows, that those views necessarily gave us a clear, transparent view on the real world, and now we have this fly's eye view in which the world is fragmented. Then our world view is inherently weaker. I wouldn't say that's the case. I think what that reveals to me is the inevitability that the world was always partial. The world was we didn't have access to those pieces of writing which would have fragmented our view. We only had access to those two television channels and a few books that came through some of the major publishers. So of course the world's going to look unified. Of course it's going to look like we look out through a picture window onto a transparent world which is laid out before us. Of course it's going to look like that. The proliferation of knowledge sources and access to authorship has demonstrated that actually it was always like that. There was just lots of worldviews that we didn't have access to, and that previously unproblematic unified vision of a clear world was always something of a myth being produced by the circumstances we lived in, it seems to me. So he does the windows thing, and then he talks, it's kind of charming, but at the same time kind of horrifying, metaphor of meals. He says, we used to, our access to knowledge used to be like the kind of meat and two veg of a traditional British lunch. Simple meal that and you kind of know what you're eating. And now he describes this where something like at a sushi bar, where there's things going past and we can pick things up as we go and as we see fit. But again, the world has always eaten sushi. There's always been pasta in the world. There's always been Indonesian cookery. It's always been out there. We just haven't had access to it. And so, of course, we've privileged the meat and two veg of our own dietary habits. That doesn't mean that that accurately represents the world, the thing that's on our plate. And yes, as with the previous ideas around proliferation of media and access to resources, yes, that might mean that because our world is not neatly circumscribed within the dinner plate portions of our knowledge anymore, because there is these thousands of different dietary choices, it might mean that we can't get it all in quite the same way that we felt we used to be able to, in the same way that we know we're not looking out onto a single and divided view through a large picture window in an English house any longer. We're looking through lots of different windows. It might be that does present a different kind of problem, but it doesn't mean to say it was better in the olden days when we all looked through picture windows onto the Kent countryside and ate meat and tea with veg. And then he goes on to talk about everyone's opinion being equally valid. This is his vision of a kind of postmodern horror, and I would support that. When postmodernism as an idea is overdone, or just badly quoted, I think more than accurately, it does often come out with people seeming to say things like, "Well, everyone's opinion is equally valid. It's all relative. There is no grand narrative. You can't tell me. There's no authority. Everyone's authority is equal." All those kind of things, and that I think is a misrepresentation of good versions of postmodern ideas. But it does. I've certainly seen and read those kind of assertions, so I know they do exist. With the idea, as I say, which is what McFarlane's saying, that in that kind of vision where we've all got equal right to have our opinions and knowledge is just about opinion, of course, it's ludicrous. But that in a sense harks back to the authority idea. Yes, there was a time undoubtedly when authority and authorship, indeed, the capacity to write the rules and to write truths and to have those truths recognised as authorial, that was much simpler. It was also built into hierarchical systems of access to knowledge. It was also built into hierarchical systems of power, which takes us right back to the beginning, to do with authority and reverence. But I think when we say, if we were tempted to say that everyone's opinion is equally valued, or what everyone chooses to call knowledge is equally knowledge, and such that all authority is equalised, that's a misrepresentation, and it's and I don't know of any serious postmodern writer who would say that. Authority is negotiated now. It certainly isn't treated with reverence, and it applies differently in different fields. And again, that harks back to what he said earlier, citing politicians, teachers, and parents as being examples of authority. These represent authorities in different fields, in different parts of our lives, in different modes of practice. And you wouldn't go to a teacher for political authority, and you wouldn't seek parental authority from a politician, and so on. And I think recognising that this thing called authority, or just knowing something and having access to information, it isn't singular. It lies in very different places, and is always open to critique. I think is valuable. Actually, I do think it's valuable. The last metaphor he has, which I think is quite telling and kind of useful, I thought, is that he talks about, and it's a well-worn metaphor, which he reminds us of, to do with how the pursuit of knowledge has been discussed in the past. And one of the ways it's always been talked about is as if it's an uphill climb, a climb up the hill of knowledge towards the sunny uplands of enlightened thought, which is a great image for knowledge. It has always felt like a climb out of the darkness towards the light, upwards towards towards a better life, upwards towards fulfillment, up towards an illumination of some kind. And he says that has been replaced by what he calls scrambling up a sandbank, or I think he said sandbank, it may have been shale bank, scrambling up a sandbank, which is a huge effort to gain something that soon dissolves. And he may be right in that, and I'm inclined to think or I'm inclined to like that metaphor, because one of the things that those questionings of authority and questionings of where authority truly lies and where knowledge truly lies and how we can access it in a world in which it is much more available, in which it is proliferated, and in which a lot of it is bogus. You can't trust what you read. You have to really know about how knowledge works, rather than trust your teacher, politician, or parent. In that kind of world, it might just be harder. We might have to treat the gathering of knowledge, or recognise that the gathering of knowledge in this world is not going to be as simple as just climbing up a mountain. It might be much more like scrambling up a sandbank, feeling things slip away, constantly having to take one step forward and take 2 steps forward for every 1 step back, and quite often feeling that the whole thing is just falling away beneath our feet. But that isn't necessarily, if that's the way we accumulate true knowledge, by recognising that we are in a sandbank, rather than pretending that we're on a relatively simple slope, and only stopping occasionally to eat nice meat and 2 veg meals and look at the uninterrupted view, then that's what we have to do. Okay, sorry this is such a long video, 20 minutes. I would recommend you have a look at Alan McFarlane's video. It's very well presented. He speaks well, and my understanding is that his channel is also, I've only just found his channel, so my understanding is he also makes good material. You know, it's a good voice to have in this environment where authority is, I mean, if ever there's an example of authority in crisis, this is it, right? So yeah, have a look at that. Thanks very much for your patience and attention.